On the afternoon of the 20th of August, 1941, a column of German tanks rolled down a narrow road southwest of Leningrad, and the men riding them had no reason to be careful. It was the third month of the invasion of the Soviet Union, and the Germans had been winning everywhere, all summer, at a pace that stunned the world. Soviet armies had been surrounded and destroyed by the hundreds of thousands. Now the tanks were closing in on Leningrad itself, and the crews were relaxed, some of them sitting up on the hulls in the summer heat with their hatches open, rolling forward through a landscape that seemed to hold nothing that could stop them. About 150 meters off the road, hidden in a grove at the edge of a swamp, a single Soviet heavy tank had been watching them come. Its commander had picked this spot the day before. He had chosen it because the road here ran along a causeway with soft, boggy ground on both sides, ground that a tank could not drive across, which meant anything on that road was trapped on it. He had even marked out 2 birch trees along the road in advance, so his gunner would know the exact range when the enemy reached them. He had let the German scouts pass by without firing. He was waiting for the main column. When the lead German tank drew level with the marker, the gunner fired, and in the next half hour, that one tank destroyed 22 German tanks, one after another, without being knocked out. It is one of the most extraordinary single actions in the history of armored warfare. And the strangest part of the story is what happened afterward, because when the commander reported what he had done, his own army did not believe him. His name was crossed off the list for his country's highest honor, in red pencil, because the men at headquarters were certain no one could have done what he claimed. It was, they thought, simply impossible. This is the story of Zinovy Kolobanov, of exactly how one tank destroyed a column many times its number, of why it worked when it should not have, and of a victory so complete that it had to be proven before anyone would accept that it was real. To understand this ambush, you have to understand how desperate the situation was for the Soviet Union in August 1941, because the calm of that German column was entirely earned. On the 22nd of June 1941, Nazi Germany had launched the largest land invasion in history against the Soviet Union. In the weeks that followed, the German army tore the Soviet defenses apart. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and captured. The Red Army lost thousands of tanks and aircraft in the opening weeks, much of it destroyed on the ground or abandoned in headlong retreat. By August, 3 great German thrusts were driving deep into Soviet territory, and the northern one had a clear target. It was aimed at Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second city, the birthplace of the revolution, a place of enormous symbolic and industrial importance. For the German High Command, and for Hitler personally, taking Leningrad was not just a military objective, but a way of tearing the heart out of the Soviet state. Standing in the way of that northern drive was a thin and crumbling line of Soviet defenses. The Soviets had thrown together a hasty defensive line along the Luga River, manned in part by militia, factory workers, and students dug in with whatever could be scraped together. And for a few weeks that line held and bought precious time. But by the middle of August it was breaking. The Germans crossed the rivers that were supposed to stop them, broke through position after position, and pushed on toward the city. The last real fortified gateway on the southwestern approach to Leningrad was a town called Krasnogvardeysk, known today as Gatchina. If the Germans took it, the road to Leningrad lay open, and behind Krasnogvardeysk there was nowhere left to fall back to. As one account records the mood of the Soviet defenders there, retreat was no longer possible, because behind them was Leningrad itself. Into this gap, the Soviets fed what little armor they had, and among the units sent to hold the approaches to Krasnogvardeysk was a company of heavy tanks commanded by a 30-year-old senior lieutenant named Zinovy Kolobanov. The tank Kolobanov commanded matters enormously to this story, so it is worth understanding what it was, and being honest about both its strengths and its flaws. It was a KV-1, named for the Soviet Defense Commissar Kliment Voroshilov. It was a heavy tank, weighing around 45 tons, and its defining feature was its armor. The front of the KV-1 was protected by around 90 millimeters of steel, thicker than anything the Germans were fielding. And in the summer of 1941, that armor made it very nearly invulnerable to the standard German anti-tank weapons. The most common German anti-tank gun of the period was a 37mm weapon that the German troops themselves had nicknamed the door knocker, because its shells simply bounced off the heavy Soviet tanks without doing any harm. The light tanks that made up much of the German force, armed with small caliber guns, could not penetrate a KV-1 from the front at any normal battle range. When German troops first encountered the KV and its cousin the T-34 that summer, it came as a genuine shock. They had not known these tanks existed, and their guns could not stop them. There are German accounts from those first weeks of a single KV blocking a road and shrugging off dozens of hits from anti-tank guns and field artillery, of shells that left nothing but bright scars on the armor, of crews watching in disbelief as their rounds bounced away. The Germans took to calling the KV the Russian Colossus. The encounter frightened the German army badly enough that it accelerated the development of heavier tanks and bigger guns of its own, a scramble that would eventually produce the Panther and the Tiger. In the summer of 1941, though, the men driving on Leningrad had nothing that could reliably kill a KV-1 from the front. But the KV-1 was not a wonder weapon, and a fair account has to say so. It was slow, capable of only around 35 kilometers an hour. Its transmission was unreliable and prone to breaking down, and when one did break down, the huge tank was extremely difficult to recover. It drank fuel, and its turret was cramped, forcing the commander to also help serve the gun, which overloaded him in combat. Across that first summer, huge numbers of KV and T-34 tanks were lost, not because the Germans could easily destroy them, but because they broke down, ran out of fuel, or were abandoned in the chaos of the retreat, with no way to repair or move them. The Soviet Union began the war with hundreds of these superb tanks and threw most of them away through breakdowns, poor tactics, and bad coordination. The KV-1 was a superb defensive weapon in the right hands and the right place, and a heavy, temperamental burden in the wrong ones. Kolobanov was about to put it in exactly the right place and use it exactly the right way. Because the truth of what happened at Voiskovice is that the tank did not win the battle by itself. The plan did. Zinovy Kolobanov was not a beginner. He was a veteran of the Winter War against Finland the year before, where he had already commanded a tank company and been decorated. He had seen what happened to tanks that were used carelessly, and he understood something that a lot of soldiers never learn, which is that a defensive battle is won before it is fought, in the choosing of the ground. He had also already been in action in this very campaign. A few days before the Great Ambush, his crew had fought a smaller engagement near the Luga River and destroyed an enemy tank and a gun, so by the 20th of August, Kolobanov and his men were not untested. They knew their machine, and they knew their business. On the 19th of August, Kolobanov was given his orders by his superiors. He was to take his company of 5 KV-1 tanks and block the German advance on the approaches to Krasnogvardeysk, and he was to hold at any cost. Kolobanov took that order literally because he understood there was nothing behind him worth retreating to. He did not simply park his tanks and wait. He studied the ground. 3 roads led toward Krasnogvardeysk through his sector, and any of them could carry a German column, so he split his tiny force to cover all 3. He placed 2 of his KV-1s to watch the Luga highway, 2 more to watch the road from Kingisepp, and he took the third and most likely approach, the road running past the state farm at Voiskovice, for himself, in tank number 864. Then he chose his exact firing position with great care. He put his tank in a hull-down position, meaning it was dug in and screened so that only its turret was exposed, hidden in a grove roughly 150 meters back from the road. Crucially, he chose a spot where the road ran along a raised causeway between areas of soft, marshy ground. That was the whole key. On that stretch, enemy tanks could not spread out or leave the road to maneuver, because the moment they drove off the causeway they would bog down helplessly in the swamp. They would be forced to stay in a single line, nose to tail, on ground of Kolobanov's choosing. He prepared everything in advance. He had each of his tanks loaded with roughly double the normal amount of ammunition, most of it armor-piercing shells rather than high explosive, because his targets would be tanks. And he registered his range in advance by picking out 2 landmarks along the road, a pair of birch trees, as aiming reference points, so that when the enemy reached them his gun commander would already know the precise distance and could hit with the first shot. His gunner, a skilled senior sergeant named Andrei Usov, would do the actual shooting, and Usov was an experienced artilleryman with a fine eye for range. The rest of the crew, the drivers Nikiforov and Rodnikov and the radio operator and loader Kiselkov, would keep the tank fed with shells and ready to move. Every man had a job, and every job had been rehearsed. Everything about the position was designed so that a single tank could do the work of many. Then Kolobanov waited. In the early afternoon of the 20th of August, the German column appeared on the road to Voiskovice, the vanguard of a panzer division driving on Leningrad, and it came on exactly as Kolobanov had hoped, strung out along the causeway, unsuspecting. Kolobanov held his fire. He let the German reconnaissance element pass by, unwilling to give away his position for a small target, and wanting the main body of tanks to be fully committed to the causeway before he sprang the trap. This took nerve. His crew sat in a hidden tank 150 meters from an enemy armored column, engines and voices low, watching German tanks roll past close enough to see the men riding on them, and did nothing, waiting for the moment when firing would do the most damage. To open too early was to waste the ambush. To wait too long was to let the column pass. Kolobanov waited until the leading tank of the main column reached his marked birch tree, the point where he knew the range to the meter. Then he gave the order, and Usov fired. The first shell destroyed the lead German tank. And here the enemy made the mistake that doomed them. The Germans, not imagining that a single Soviet tank was engaging them, assumed the lead tank had struck a mine, and the column stopped. That pause was fatal. With the column halted and bunched up, Usov put a second shell into the next tank. Only now did the Germans understand they were under fire, but they could not find where it was coming from. The KV-1 was hidden, hull down and screened, and its position was hard to spot. And then Kolobanov did the thing that turned a good ambush into a massacre. He had Usov shift fire to the very last tank in the column, at the rear, and destroy it. Now the German column was boxed in. There was a wrecked, burning tank blocking the road at the front and another blocking it at the back, and swamp on both sides. The remaining tanks were trapped in a line with nowhere to go. What followed was methodical and terrible. The trapped German tanks fired back furiously, but they were firing almost blind, unable to locate the hidden Soviet tank, their shells searching the tree line and the grove where they guessed the fire was coming from. Some tried to drive off the road to escape or maneuver, and bogged down in the soft ground exactly as Kolobanov had foreseen, becoming stationary targets that could not even turn to face their attacker. And Usov worked down the column, tank by tank, with the pre-registered range making his shooting deadly accurate. There was no need to guess distances or walk shells onto the target. Every tank in that column was a known range on ground Kolobanov had measured, and Usov simply took them in turn, methodically converting a German armored spearhead into a row of burning wrecks. Inside the KV-1, the crew were half deafened by the crash of their own gun and the hammering of German shells against the hull, and half blinded by the smoke that filled the fighting compartment, and they simply kept loading and firing, over and over, in a metal box that rang like a struck bell every few seconds as another German round slammed into the armor and failed to get through. The loader Kiselkov fed shell after shell into the breach, until his arms must have burned with it. The German shells could not penetrate. Again and again they struck the KV-1 and failed to break through. At one point, a hit shot away the tank's periscope, blinding it for a moment, and a crewman had to replace the periscope under fire so they could keep seeing the enemy. Another hit jammed the turret briefly. Still they kept firing. By the time the guns fell silent, the KV-1 had been struck more than 130 times, and not one of those hits had pierced the armor. In roughly half an hour, firing around 98 rounds, Kolobanov's single tank had destroyed 22 German tanks, along with 2 towed anti-tank guns that had been brought up and knocked out before they could do any harm. Kolobanov's tank was not the only one fighting that day. His plan had covered 3 roads, and the other tanks of his company had their own encounters with the German advance. On the other approaches, his crews met other German probes and fought their own sharp actions, adding to the day's toll. The care Kolobanov had taken in spreading his 5 tanks across every possible route meant that wherever the Germans tried to come, they ran into a dug-in KV-1 they could not kill. Across the whole action around Voiskovitsy and Krasnogvardeysk, the 5 KV-1 tanks of Kolobanov's company destroyed a combined total of around 43 German tanks, of which 22 were Kolobanov's own. It was, by a wide margin, one of the most successful single-tank actions of the entire war, and it was not a one-day wonder followed by collapse. For roughly 3 weeks after the ambush, Kolobanov's company continued to hold the approaches to Krasnogvardeysk, fighting a stubborn delaying action against the German advance and later helping to cover the Soviet retreat toward the town of Pushkin, closer to Leningrad. The company did not just win a single spectacular fight and disappear. It kept fighting and kept buying time, day after day, in the way that mattered most when a whole front was collapsing. The tactical achievement was real and significant in its immediate sector. A single well-placed company had checked, for a time, the vanguard of a German armored thrust that had been rolling forward almost unopposed. But what happened next, when Kolobanov reported his victory up the chain of command, is the part of the story that says the most, both about the man and about how history decides what to believe. Kolobanov's superiors, the men who knew him and had given him his orders, understood at once that something remarkable had happened. In September 1941, his regimental commander, an officer who had himself been the very first tank soldier ever named a hero of the Soviet Union, and his divisional commander, another hero of the Soviet Union, both put Kolobanov and his entire crew forward for that same highest honor, the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The recommendations went up to the headquarters of the Leningrad front, and there, someone refused to believe them. According to the accounts, the nominations were struck out, crossed through in red pencil, and downgraded. The reason was simple and revealing. The claim was too large. A single tank destroying 22 others, a single company destroying 43, sounded to the staff officers like an exaggeration, the kind of inflated number a unit might report to make itself look good. They found the report, in a word, unbelievable. So instead of the gold star of a hero of the Soviet Union, Kolobanov received the Order of the Red Banner. His gunner Usov received the Order of Lenin, the rest of the crew received lesser decorations, and Kolobanov, who had arguably fought the most successful single-tank action of the war, would never be named a hero of the Soviet Union, not then and not for the rest of his life. This is the point in the story where WARFRONT has to be careful and honest, because the doubt of those staff officers was not unreasonable in principle. Extraordinary battlefield claims are often inflated. Every army in the war overcounted its kills, sometimes wildly. Pilots claimed aircraft that flew home. Gunners claimed tanks that were only damaged and later repaired. A responsible historian treats a report of one tank destroying 22 others with exactly the skepticism those officers applied. The difference, in this case, is that the claim was checked, and it held up. The wreckage of the German column was there on the ground to be counted, a line of burned-out hulls on a causeway that anyone could walk along and tally. And later research pointed to the records of the German side, including the war diary of the German Panzer Division involved, which documented heavy tank losses in that area on that date. The very fact that made the achievement hard to believe, its sheer scale, is also the reason it left so much physical evidence behind. The burned-out tanks did not lie. There is a sad irony worth naming here. In the decades after the war, and especially in the years after the Soviet Union collapsed, a great deal was written celebrating the exploits of German tank aces and pilots, their high scores repeated and admired, while comparable Soviet feats were often quietly doubted or ignored, dismissed as propaganda. Kolobanov's ambush, one of the most successful single-tank actions anyone on any side achieved in the entire war, spent years in that shadow, a story many people had never heard and some refused to credit. It is a strange fate for a feat that was, in fact, more thoroughly documented than most. That distinction between a claim and a verified fact is the whole of it. Kolobanov's ambush is not a legend that grew in the retelling. It is one of the rare, extraordinary war stories that was doubted by its own side and then confirmed by the evidence, including the evidence of the enemy. It earns its place not because it sounds incredible, but because it survived being tested. It would be easy to end there, on the triumph, but that would leave out the truth of what August 1941 actually was, and the ambush means more when it is placed honestly in that larger picture. Kolobanov's stand delayed one German thrust in one sector. It did not save Leningrad. The German drive on the city could not be stopped by a single company of tanks, however brilliantly handled, and within weeks the Germans had reached the outskirts and cut the city off from the rest of the country. What followed was one of the most terrible episodes of the entire war, the siege of Leningrad, which lasted nearly 900 days. The Germans chose not to storm the city, but to encircle it and starve it into submission. Through the first winter, with almost no food coming in, the people of Leningrad died in their hundreds of thousands, eating whatever they could find, burning their furniture and their books to survive the cold, hauling their dead through the snow on sledges. More than 1 million people, most of them civilians, died inside the encircled city before the siege was finally lifted. Kolobanov's 22 tanks were a magnificent tactical victory inside a strategic catastrophe that was still unfolding all around him, and that no single act of heroism could have prevented. That is the honest weight of it. On the same day, Kolobanov was destroying a German column almost single-handedly. The war as a whole was going catastrophically for his country. His feat did not turn the tide. It was one bright, hard point of defiance in a summer of disasters, a demonstration that the Germans could be hurt badly by a defender who knew what he was doing, even as the front as a whole caved in. It is worth holding both of those truths at once, because that is what the summer of 1941 actually was. a season in which individual acts of astonishing skill and courage happened inside a collapse so vast that they could not stop it, only slow it, and remind a reeling country that the enemy was not invincible. And the war was not done with Kolobanov either. On the 15th of September 1941, less than a month after his great ambush, a German shell exploded next to his tank while it was being refueled and rearmed near Pushkin. He was very seriously wounded, with injuries to his head and spine, and he was out of the war for a long time, recovering from wounds that could easily have killed him. The man who had destroyed 22 tanks in half an hour was nearly killed himself while his tank sat still, taking on fuel, a reminder that on that front, survival often had nothing to do with skill or courage at all. Zinovy Kolobanov survived his wounds and survived the war. He recovered, returned to service, and remained in the Soviet army for years afterward, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He lived out his later life in Minsk and died in 1994. He was never made a hero of the Soviet Union, and though there were efforts in later years to have the honor granted to him at last, it never happened in his lifetime. For a long time, his feat lingered in a strange obscurity. It was doubted at the time, downgraded in the awards, and then, in the decades that followed, it was often overlooked or questioned, even as the exploits of German tank aces were celebrated in book after book. The most successful single tank action of the Second World War was, for years, a story many people had simply never heard, or had heard and dismissed. There is an account that when a Soviet television program in the 1970s wanted to tell his story, the proposal was rejected by superiors as too far-fetched to put on screen. The disbelief that had cost him his hero's star in 1941 followed him for the rest of his life. Today a monument stands near Gachina to mark the place. Fittingly, and a little sadly, the tank on the monument is not even a KV-1, because by the time it was built, no KV of the right type could be found, so a later heavy tank stands in for the one that actually fought there. A small final irony for a battle that was itself almost too hard to pin down. The lasting lesson of Voiskovitsy is not that the KV-1 was invincible, because it was not. Plenty of KV tanks were lost that same summer, and Kolobanov himself was nearly killed in his. The lesson is that Kolobanov did almost everything right before the first shot was ever fired. He chose ground where the enemy could not maneuver. He hid his tank where it could not easily be found. He measured his range in advance. He loaded for the fight he expected. He trapped the column by killing the front and the rear first. He turned a tough but flawed machine into something close to unbeatable by putting it in the one situation where all of its strengths counted and none of its weaknesses mattered. The armor let him survive being the bait. The plan did the killing. Take that same tank and that same crew and put them in the open, in bad ground, without preparation, and the story could easily have ended the way so many others did that summer, with a broken down or burning KV abandoned by the road. The machine did not make the victory, the thinking did. And there is one more thing his story leaves behind, which is why it belongs on this channel in particular. The greatest single tank action of the war was very nearly lost to history, because it was too impressive to be believed. It took the wreckage on the ground, and the enemy's own records, to prove that it happened. That is the line between a war legend and a war fact, and Kolobanov's ambush is one of the few that walked right up to that line, was tested against it, and came through as true. Kolobanov won by choosing his ground and waiting. Next time on WARFRONT, we follow a tank crew who had nowhere to hide and no time to plan, in a duel fought out in the open, in the ruins of a city, and captured from start to finish on film. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to WARFRONT and the next battle will find you.